Welcome to our second day of the Image Bearers Conference. I know in our faith tradition, which is the International Church of Christ, we typically do not celebrate as much the various seasons of the Christian year. Yes, we do have Easter, we do have Christmas, and so forth. We want to take a special time today, and really yesterday and today, to really reflect on Jesus and what he means to each one of us. So we have some special lessons today. The first one is a Tov church. The second is communion in Christ's body. The third is conform to Christ. And the last is Christ's afflictions. Basically the fact that, Jesus' work is not done. He still wants us to take the mantle and do something effective with our lives while we are still here. And then after that, we have a panel discussion, 2:45 to 3:45, and then just a chance to recognize some image bearers who have done great things in our midst. I think you guys will find that particularly inspiring. So right now I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Becky Castle-Miller, who is actually going to be interviewing Laura Barringer for this next section. So she will do the introductions for our guest. I'll hand it over to her.
Good morning. Thank you all so much for joining us today. I am really happy to be talking with my friend Laura Barringer today. Laura is a school teacher in Chicagoland, and she's the daughter of Scott McKnight. Most of you will be familiar with Scott's books. And Laura and Scott together wrote 2 books about transforming church culture, a church called Tov and Pivot. And I have to shout out the amazing cover art for Pivot because you can see Tov in the art. I love that so much. So Laura wrote these books with her dad recently, but this is not the first time that she's co-authored a book with her dad. Laura, back in 2014, you wrote Sharing God's Love, Jesus Creed for Children. Can you tell us a little bit about that experience before we jump into talking about the Tov books?
Sure. Yeah. Hi. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be with all of you today and lovely to see you as always, Becky. So Sharing God's Love, the Jesus Creed for Children came out. It feels so long ago. I've forgotten about that adventure. I took my father's book, the Jesus Creed, and then I used the principles that he taught, and I wrote those specifically for children. So I have spent most of my adult professional career, actually all of it, teaching young children. So that project actually really meant a lot to me, to be able to teach them the truths of who Jesus is and how we should treat other people because we love him. And then forming that specifically for children.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. So how did a school teacher end up writing a book about church culture and church abuse? Tell me your story around that.
It is an interesting journey. It is not a journey or a path that I ever planned on taking. I'll show if we could show the first slide in the presentation, the next one, let's go here. It actually started with this article, and this came out on March 23, 2018, about my former pastor and my former church. And I was actually out to dinner at the time with my husband when my parents sent us the headline of this article.
Mm-hmm.
I read it out loud to him, and we kind of just rolled our eyes and we're like, okay, whatever. We've been hearing rumblings about this. My husband had been hearing rumblings about this for a long time. And then we put it away. And then on the way home from dinner, I started reading the article out loud to him. And we knew the names of the women.
Yeah.
And we felt like, from the beginning, we felt like these are not women that would lie. These are familiar names. These are people that we know. They don't have a reason to be contentious and make up a story and be wounded from the story. And then when we saw and experienced the church's reaction to what the women were saying, it was sort of like a ping pong ball. The women would say one thing and then the church would say another. And it felt I use the word disorienting because I felt like, I remember the moment of realization that, okay, only one side here could be telling the truth.
Mhm.
And I naively had not experienced a church before not telling the truth. In fact, saying vicious things about my friends, people that I knew
Mhm.
that were lies. And so that honestly is how the whole journey began for us. I never intended to write a book. My father is a very prolific author, but I'm a teacher. I'm a school teacher. That's how I was educated, and that's my passion and what I love to do. I do love to write as a side hobby, but I never intended to write a book about the topic.
Mhm.
I wanted him to do the writing. Um, you know how that is, Becky, and then you
Oh,
get
yeah.
into a project.
Oh, yeah, yeah.
Co
I had to work with Scott on a discipleship curriculum following King Jesus. I said, "Hey, Scott, have you ever considered writing a discipleship curriculum?" He's like, I don't know. Why don't you do it?" I'm like, okay.
That's sort of how it went. That's how
Yeah,
it went for me too, and all of a sudden, I find myself writing a book, but I felt like, "Wait, I can do this," and you know that feeling, like, "I
yeah,
can do this. I know what needs to be said." I don't know if I wanna take the shots that are gonna come back at me, but
sure.
you know how that is too. So,
Yeah.
that is
And
honestly
I was just noting the date on the article that you put up on the screen. So that was exactly 6 years ago today,
Oh,
which right, it was March 23rd, 2018,
yeah,
which is today. And so I was counting. I'm like, wow, like it does not feel like it was 6 years ago that that bombshell dropped.
yeah.
And, the raft of abuse allegations that have come out in other churches since then. It's almost like the Willow Creek story was the victims who spoke out there gave others the gift of going second. Um,
Mm.
once people saw that, okay, women can speak out and be believed now, other women in other churches have come forward. How else has your life and your interactions with the church in general changed in these 6 years?
Do you mean Willow Creek or do you mean big church?
I mean, you and like your interactions with like big C church, like
Yeah.
the church, like how has that impacted your church journey, where you go to church, your view of church, your trust in church, all of those things?
I certainly understand the difficulty of church wounds. I haven't been abused by a church or I haven't been a victim of like spiritual abuse, but I certainly understand being hurt by church. I have always felt I understand how people may hold church, like it can be difficult and they may hold things against the church. I have always felt like it wasn't God that wounded me, or it
Hmm.
wasn't God that wounded the Willow Creek whistleblowers. It wasn't God that did any of the wounding for people that have been hurt. It's people, right, that have done the wounding. So in my mind, I'm able to separate Big C church from the people that have done the wounding.
Hmm.
Though I certainly understand that that's a struggle for others, and I've seen that. But my view of church and what it should be and how God designed it to be, that has not changed, and in fact, that is one of the reasons why I speak and why I've written what I've done is because
Hmm.
it's not God. It's not God doing the wounding. It's not God, um, that lied. It's not God that spiritually abused. It's people that have done that. And I'm
Hmm.
able to, fortunately, I'm able to separate that in my mind.
Hmm. That helps a lot. So tell me more about this Hebrew word tov that you guys have used in both book titles. What is tov, and why did you decide to orient these books around that word?
Tove, we have a slide for this one too. So I learned pretty quickly after I started working with my dad that Tove is a beautiful little three-letter word. It is a Hebrew word and it means goodness. And we know that God is good. We know that from our Bible that creation is good, the law is good, everything that God created is good. So Jesus was also Tov. Jesus was our Tov shepherd, and we are called to also be Tov, correct? And it really, I like how Ann Voskamp, one of my favorite authors, when she read the book. She said it really is this little 3-letter beautiful word. It is a word that should shape our entire lives as
Mhm.
followers of Christ. Jesus is the ultimate good. He's the ultimate Tov shepherd, and the Spirit transforms us as we allow ourselves to be open to him. The Spirit transforms us into Tov, into goodness.
Mhm. Mhm.
So we had a funny conversation with our publisher about this little word tov. They said, "Oh, well, we don't put Hebrew titles. We don't put Hebrew words on the titles of our books." And anyone, Becky, you can laugh. My dad, he's like, "Oh, well, that's okay. It's a really good title. We're going to keep it."
He's very particular about titles.
Very. So, but what he had noticed is when he would start using this word tov with his graduate students, that it was catchy. And
Mhm.
before long, they were all using it and referring to things like, in the world, or like my dog, as tov.
Yeah.
And he felt like, no, this is it. Like, this is a major moral, I shouldn't just say feel, but we know it's a major moral category in our Bible. And
Mhm.
so when we look at these situations that sadly have arisen, starting for me with the Willow Creek story, is that what we have seen is not Tov. Tov people don't do to others what we have seen happen in so many church
Right.
stories.
Yeah. So what are the characteristics of a Tov church? What does goodness culture look like in a church? How do you assess that?
Okay, so our slide, I made a slide for us on this one. It is called, to help with the visual here. Let's go to the next one. We started with, sadly, with the toxic sides
Mhm.
of church
Mhm.
culture and what we had too often seen. So a Tov church is the opposite of the toxicities. I understand that ra, is the Hebrew word for like it's for evil. So it's like the
Evil.
opposite
Yeah.
of tov.
Mhm.
So what we did is we started with what are we seeing? We know that Willow Creek is just one of, I know now because I was naive at the time, is just one of way too many churches, but
Yeah.
we had seen these patterns emerge from toxic cultures. So we had seen too much narcissism, employees living in a fear culture, and not just employees, but some church goers where they were quiet because of the fear that was running rampant in the church. We call it institution creep. So instead of putting people first, the
Mhm.
institution and its reputation came
Yep.
above human beings.
Yeah.
Um, we saw a lot of churches creating spin. We called it spin. Like, it would just be like a false narrative rather than telling the truth.
Mhm.
Toxic churches have loyalty culture. A lot of times there can be celebrity culture and a leadership culture. So a Tov church does we took each of those toxic traits and flipped it into Tov. So rather than having a narcissistic culture, what is the opposite of narcissism? Well, it's empathy. And so a Tov church, a good church, will be empathetic. A
Mhm.
Tov church will not let fear run rampant.
Mhm.
People will live and experience grace. A Tov, a good church, puts people first, not the institution, not its
Mhm.
reputation. It puts people first. A
Yeah.
Tov church, and this is probably one of my favorite chapters of the book, a Tov church tells the truth.
Yeah.
And this is really where our book started. And my dad, the part that he wrote about Yom Kippur and the Israelite tradition of once a year collectively confessing sin. In our church tradition, Lent is kind of a good like alternative to
Mhm.
that. It
Mhm.
was such an important part of being Tov, of because we're all human beings. We all fall so far short of what, the glory of God, but he is faithful and beautiful when we confess to forgive us. And
Mhm.
so many of the churches that we had heard about were completely skipping their complicity. They were skipping Yom Kippur, if you will.
Mhm.
So that's a really important part, and that's the center, the heart of Tov. Then good Tov churches resist a loyalty culture because they
Mhm.
nurture a spirit of justice.
Yeah.
Celebrity culture was a big one, and I don't mean to be hard on Willow Creek. I use it as an example because I'm familiar with it,
Mhm.
and I confess my complicity in contributing to the celebrity culture there. But there is a big celebrity culture, and the opposite of that is to nurture a culture and a spirit of service.
Mhm.
And then one final pattern that we had noticed is the leadership culture has kind of taken over, where some churches feel more like a corporation, a business, and rather that's not what church is supposed to be. I've learned that churches are not a business. They should not be run by leaders. They should be run by pastors who nurture all of us into Christ likeness. So
Absolutely.
the way that we develop and build a good church, is by resisting those toxic patterns.
Right. And I love how you've done that opposite there, like Tove and Ra. Okay. So then, empathy instead of narcissism, and just like flipping all of them. I think that's a really great approach. So this is one of the key illustrations from a church called Tove. And I want us to look at one of the key illustrations from Pivot. As we're pulling up that slide of the peach tree, I want to let everyone know that we are going to spend some time at the end of this session doing a Q&A. So if you have any questions for Laura or about changing church cultures, put those in the chat and we'll leave time at the end to address those. So this is the tree image from Pivot, and you write that church culture isn't static, it's constantly changing. Tell us how this illustration explains the growth and change of church culture.
I'm smiling because this all came about because I have a peach tree in my backyard, and we planted it. My husband and I planted it when we first bought our house 11 years ago.
Mhm.
And when we were starting to develop an illustration for church culture, we needed a tree. And I was like, oh, our peach tree is perfect because it is, by all appearances, a very unhealthy tree.
Mhm.
We've never gotten one to eat one peach off of this tree in 11 years. It has a fungus every spring. There's branches that fall out. I was like, that's where it all came from, is from the very unhealthy peach tree in my backyard.
Mhm.
So shortly after A Church Called Tove came out, the interest in the book was I don't know that I had any expectations. This is not the publishing world is not one in which I was familiar or lived in at the time. I was shocked at the number of people that wanted to speak with me, with my father, with both of us, about their experiences in church. And sadly, most of those conversations, and when I say conversations, we were getting letters. We were getting, for a year or more, we were getting a letter or two or more a week. And most of those were from people who had been victims of power abuse in their church. So they had been somehow wounded by a leader, or leaders in the
Mhm.
church. And so people started asking us, okay, so you wrote this book, A Church Called Tove, and we want to have a Tove church. We want to have what you've described here. We
Mhm.
want to have, we want to nurture empathy and grace, and we want to put people first and tell the truth, and we want to have a spirit of justice and nurture service and living like Christ. But how to do that? And I was like, oh, I have no idea.
Sure.
I am a teacher. I am busy making back to school ready confetti. I have no idea how you do this.
Mhm.
But that was a really common question, and it became more frequent. It never really went away. And my dad and I kind of looked at each other and thought, we need to figure this out, because this question is becoming more and more prevalent of how do how do
Mhm.
how do you nurture a culture, or how do you change it? And what we found is there is quite a bit of research out there, but it's mostly for the business world. And we
Mhm.
didn't find anything about how do you change or nurture a Christian culture.
Mm-hmm.
So we took the research that we had and adapted it for a Christian, whether it's a church or a company or organization, one that wants to be Tove. We took the research and adapted it for a Christian organization. And so that's where the second book Pivot came from,
Mm-hmm.
is to answer that question that was more and more frequent of, how do we do this? And that's what the peach tree is designed to do. That's where the illustration came from.
Mm-hmm. So explain the cycle or the connection then between the roots, the soil, the tree, the fruit. What do each of those represent in the illustration?
Okay, so there's the health of the tree, there's health of the soil. We say and still believe, and this is it's a pretty illustration, but it's research based, that everything starts with the soil. That the soil, I'm going to go to the next slide. The soil is the home for the nutrients. The soil feeds the rest of the tree and nurtures the tree, and it fights off disease. That's what soil
Mm-hmm.
does.
Mm-hmm.
So when I have this peach tree in my yard that's essentially very unhealthy because it's dropping branches, the problem is not the branch dropping, it's a symptom of the soil. So in a healthy, well, first let's look at a toxic culture and what is feeding
Mm-hmm.
the soil. So the tree might be unhealthy because there's ambition in the soil, because of competition, or there's some type of greed or abuse of power, that churches might be measuring success and how many people come to the church and sit in the pews, and consumerism or glory or fame. And those are the nutrients in the soil that are feeding the branches and the leaves and like, you might still get some really beautiful peaches, right? Like, you have a beautiful Sunday service, a beautiful building, but somewhere there are unhealthy manifestations of what's actually happening underneath.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And throughout Pivot, there are multiple continuations of the illustration to say, okay, taking this kind of intervention would be just like trimming branches, or taking this kind of intervention would be just like painting the tree. So things like preaching a sermon series on goodness, or finding worship songs with the word good in them, doing Sunday school curriculum, putting buttons on that say like all of those things are just painting the tree. So what is it then that changes the soil? How do we really
So
transform?
the best way, I think, as a teacher, the best way I can answer this question is with an example.
Mm-hmm.
I read during the writing of Pivot, a book showed up at my house, and I had never heard of it before. It was called Renovation of the Church, and it was written by two pastors, Kent Carlson and Mike Lucan. And I had never heard of it. My dad said, read this and then write about it for Pivot. So I opened it up, and it ended up being one of the most beautiful parts of the entire process for me, because it is a beautiful example of transformation. And it started with image bearers acknowledging their complicity in the culture they had created.
Mm-hmm.
So these pastors recognized, they founded a church. Let me give a little backstory. Founded a church in California, Folsom, California, and they ended up coming out here to Willow Creek, attended a conference, and they place no blame on Willow Creek. They say everything we tried worked, and our attendance boomed. And they said, we were known by Willow Creek as the next up and coming leaders.
Mm-hmm.
They said we liked feeling important, like in that aspect. It felt really powerful, they said, to stand in front of the auditorium or wherever at the end of the service and have people lined up to speak with them. And they recognized, this is a quote, almost a direct quote from one of the pastors. They said, our ambition had gotten completely run away. They don't use the term soil, but what had started feeding their church culture was consumerism. It was how many people are coming and sitting in the seats. being kind of famous in circles, and ambition again was the big one that they used. And they said, we started to feel like there was a monster in our church basement, and like we had to put on a performance, and the people loved the performance, but the problem was they wanted a bigger and better one the next weekend, and
Mhm.
they were totally run down. And they said we had created consumers, so they completely removed those toxic elements from the soil and put in Tove ones instead.
Mhm.
So they, um, and by the way, it was tumultuous. I don't want to like paint
Sure.
it was all a beautiful picture, but they lost a lot of their, like, I think their attendance dropped by half. But they said they started reading Dallas Willard, they started reading
Mhm.
Eugene Peterson, and they felt like our Sunday service, the way that we are running our church, the way that we are living out our culture is actually working against the invitation of Christ to be transformed.
Mhm.
And so they removed those elements from the soil and replaced them instead with living like Jesus. And that's literally what they did. The staff was completely confused because a lot of them, most of them had been hired for their talent, for their skill.
Mhm.
People, the consumers in the pews were like, what are we doing? Like the music isn't as great, like, but they said they just steadily pushed against the consumerism in the soil, and they just got up week by week and taught people how to live like Jesus lives.
Mhm.
And
That's
that is the best way that I can explain
Mhm.
how to you can't just add things to the soil, you also have to remove what is toxic.
Mhm. Mhm. Absolutely. We live that out every summer at our house in Wheaton. Wheaton was basically built on a swamp, and it is not like the soil here was not designed to have pretty ornamental trees that like people like to have in their suburb, right? So all of the trees in our neighborhood really are not native, and every one of our neighbors, us included, have to fight every year to keep our trees alive because the soil isn't good for them. So like that's been a huge thing for us learning to be suburbanites is like keeping our trees alive by trying to nourish the soil and
Right.
give it the things it doesn't have. So like we do fight that battle with our actual trees, and that gives me a lot of empathy. And for the church leaders who are doing the same thing, it's constant vigilance, it's constant work of
Mhm.
not letting those toxins, the mold, the rot, come back in and constantly nourishing that soil.
And Becky, I've heard this a lot too, is over the last few years because of the continuous conversations we've had, is pastor will come in, maybe a new pastor, and they'll say, well, I wasn't here when all this happened, like I wasn't part of the culture. But what we've learned is that culture is like, it's like alive, it is active, it's living.
Mhm.
And just because there's a new person that comes in doesn't mean some of these elements are not alive in the culture. And so
Sure.
that really needs to be looked at too, is listening to the pain of the past,
Mhm.
and like being willing to confess what needs to be confessed and own what needs to be owned. Just
Yeah.
because a person is gone doesn't mean the culture has completely transformed itself. It takes
Right.
intentional nurturing.
Yeah, and it's not just churches that need to go that through that, but any Christian institution that wants to be truly Christ-like. I've seen that this year at Wheaton College. I'm a PhD student at Wheaton College, and the college, instead of doing spin, took a really honest look at its racist history, and
Mm,
they commissioned an investigation, and they looked at some of the policies and leaders who had supported systemic racism in the school's history. And instead of spinning that, they just honestly released the report, confessed, like there's been lamentation, there's been confession, there's been immediate change, like changing the names of buildings that were named after previous racist leaders. So like
mhm.
getting to see that up close and seeing, like you said, it's not spin, but it's truth telling.
Yeah.
And you lose support when you tell truth, but it's really encouraging to see Christian institutions make the changes that need to happen?
I got to see one as well. When when we started writing a church called Tove, my dad sent me to research and find Tove stories of goodness. And I will be honest with you, it was really, there weren't very many out there to
Sure.
find, partly because Tove pastors don't want the glory for what they're doing. So
Hmm.
it's not like they're out there sharing their story. It's not that easy to find. But I did find a beautiful story from Kentucky, and the pastor, there was a allegations of abuse that came out before he was the pastor. When they came forward, when the victim came forward, they were cared for. The story,
Hmm.
they were listened to. The pastor said, "Listen, this is a part of our past. We need to own it. We are going to," he was upfront with the congregation. He said, "We are going to have an investigation. It's going to be done by an outside person. They're going to come in, and whatever they find, the truth will lead us, and we
Hmm.
will own what we need to own." And he ended up, this pastor who wasn't even there at the time when all of the abuse happened, he ended up apologizing
Wow.
to the victim, to the family, to the church, and then to the entire community of Lexington, Kentucky. He apologized and he said,
Wow.
"This is the history of our church." But guess what? It was healing. People were,
Hmm.
the victim felt cared for, they felt
Yeah.
honored. Um, so they, that was, it was just such a stunning example. It brought tears to my eyes because I
Hmm.
felt like if Willow Creek could have treated Vonda Dyer and Nancy Beach and Carrie Latch, if they would have treated these women, these victims, the way that he treated the victims in Kentucky, what a different story of grace
Right.
this could have been.
Yeah. And I've, because of my own family past connections to International House of Prayer and Mike Bickle in Kansas City, I've been following that story
Yeah.
closely. There's been a complete lack of Tove from some of the leaders, but some of the leaders have tried. Like some of the leaders have really tried and said, this needs to change. There's abuse. We need to talk about it. And they ended up having to resign because the rest of the leaders didn't want to confront it. But again, what a different story it would be instead of 6 months of more and more and more damaging truth coming out, like more and more branches falling off the tree. Like, what if they had addressed it well? And so maybe that's a piece of advice to anyone in church leadership listening is abuse is going to happen. There will be abusers who come into your church and harm people. What you do about it makes a difference. Laura, what would you say for people in either lay leadership, like volunteer roles, or people in church leadership, when abuse allegations are made, how should they properly handle those things?
I would look to examples of that, the example that I just shared. It was Tate's Creek Presbyterian Church in
Mm-hmm.
Lexington, Kentucky. Thinking of the principles of Tove that we talked about earlier, putting people first, telling the truth, not worried about protecting the reputation of the institution or the leader. I spoke with a number of people at Willow Creek that felt like, well, I saw things and they bothered me and they probably were red flags, but I didn't want to say anything. I didn't want to
Mm-hmm.
hurt the church. And it's certainly understandable, but that's an example of putting the reputation above actual people that are
Yeah.
made in the image of God that he loves and cares about.
Mm-hmm.
God will take care of it. He will take
Yes.
care. We don't need to protect the church's reputation. He will
Mm-hmm.
take care of it. In the end, all it will be fine, you know?
Yeah.
But putting people first is how allegations need to be dealt with when they come
Mm-hmm.
forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. Wholeheartedly agree. And engaging uh, organizations who know this stuff, like Grace, for example, Godly Response to Abuse in Christian Environments. Bring in the experts because most church leaders are not trained in how to deal with these things. So pay the people who are trained to do this.
And too often what we see is churches investigating when really what they're trying to do is cover up
Mm-hmm.
and control the narrative so
Mm-hmm.
that the truth is not known. But we know
Yeah.
that we serve a God of truth. God is truth. and he's not going to be lying, right? So we need to be Tov, we need to be like him, telling the truth, living in grace, protecting and caring for those that have been wounded is what we advocate for.
Right. When the investigating firm is actually a legal firm whose goal is to protect the institution, you know that's a red flag that a real proper investigation is not going to be done. Like the victims are not going to be centered there. We have about 10 minutes left in the session, and so I want to give people an opportunity to write their questions in the chat. Your questions about the books, your questions about healthy and unhealthy church environments, how to create change. As you put those in, we'll be able to see them, and I'll bring those up. So Laura, in my work in pastoral care and in my work as an emotion coach, one of the major questions I get from people when they're recovering from spiritual abuse or starting to notice unhealthy things in their church is, what can I as a layperson do? I'm not a church leader, I don't have authority, but I see that things are wrong. Is there anything I can do to help change my church culture? What would you say to people who ask that?
So I feel like I have a lot to learn from you, actually, Becky. You probably know a lot more than I do on this topic. I will tell you, this is another reason why we wrote Pivot, because people kept asking us. We would get letters from people who had been abused, or they had seen a friend that had been a victim of some type of power abuse at a church, and they would ask us, like, I just attend the church. What can I do? And that question was so frequent. I'd love to hear what you've learned from your experience, Becky, but what we have told people is, and we did write about this in Pivot too, is, listen, if you are, the farther away from power you are, the less influence you're going to have over decision making. And that's just reality. So I attend a church. I'm not in leadership. I don't have the power to influence how decisions are made or how people are treated. Or if I see something concerning, I can address it. I can bring it up. I can confront what needs to be confronted, but I don't have the power to change anything. And that is that is reality. Now, we have told people I feel like there isn't one solution for every person. I feel like everybody needs to submit to the Spirit and follow where He leads and ask God, what is my role in this? For some people, it might be, you need to leave. Like, you need to protect yourself and you need to leave. For other people, it might be, I'm going to stay and address the issue and try to be a change maker. For other people, we've told them we talked about forming pockets of Tov. So you can't influence the decision making at the leadership level at your church, at the pastoral level, but you can form your own pocket of Tov where you as a community live Tovly together, where maybe that's your small group or maybe that's your ministry. You have influence over that community. And in fact, one of my favorite stories from the last year, I was speaking at the Restore conference where I saw Becky in person back in October. And shortly after I spoke, a woman came up and introduced herself and said, we did it. We formed a pocket of Tov in our church. And that they live Tovly together in their community. And hopefully over time, that pocket will spill over and others will want to join and live Tovly as well. And hopefully it will reach those that have the influence, that have the power to influence and make decisions. And by the way, a baby was born recently in their pocket of Tov, and they named him Tov.
That's amazing. I love that. It's actually a really good name.
Little baby Tov. I know. I was
beautiful.
Like, that's so cute. Yeah.
Wow. I love that story.
Yeah.
One of the things I've learned is in studying spiritual abuse for the past 15 years, is that abusers will only use as much power as necessary to keep people in line. Like they learn what the line is. And when people start to resist, they will start to ratchet up the amount of power and force needed. And they also groom some people to think that they are good, so that when victims who are being harmed speak up, the other people will say, well, he's or she's never treated me that way, so you must be lying. So it's interesting though, those who think that the leader is good, if they cross the line or oppose the leader, suddenly the abusive force is going to be directed at them and it will be shocking and disorienting to them. You tell a story in Pivot about a woman who just simply asked, can I be in the meetings where decisions happen? And just for asking for input, she was removed from her position and retaliated against. So that happens. Sometimes when you speak up, the abuse will be targeted at you. So we have to be careful of that. I see some questions coming in. Tyler asks, if there has been abuse in the past and if change isn't on the horizon, is there a good way to forgive and continue to stay faithful if moving isn't an option?
What do you think, Becky?
I mean, I think we can always leave a church.
But I was going to say, form a pocket of Tove or leave.
Or leave. Yeah. If you are not safe and if staying is harming your nervous system, your body, because you're being traumatized, you won't be able to do anyone good if you end up broken by the PTSD caused by a spiritual leader. So sometimes you have to protect yourself and leave if change is not possible. But just as in relationships of intimate partner violence, it is very hard to leave sometimes. And so I understand that it's hard for people to leave abusive situations. So you can forgive, but that doesn't mean you have to stay. Like you can forgive and protect yourself at the same time. So those are some of my thoughts on that.
I would say, yeah. And I was so encouraged by this woman that told me we created a pocket of Tove. And I thought, that's beautiful. They wanted to stay. They didn't want to lose their community. So they're working together to nurture empathy and justice and telling the truth. And hopefully over time, as years go on, maybe that will spill out into the rest of the congregation.
Yeah, exactly. And Odessa asks, can you give examples of consumerism in the church? You talked a lot about consumerism in your opening illustration. How do you notice consumerism in the church?
So I'm going to confess that I was a consumer at Willow Creek.
There's some good truth telling.
I wrote about this. I think, in the first book in a church called Tove. Is my husband and I got into, he was a consumer too, I suppose, got into this really bad rut of like, okay, so this is an example. Who is speaking this weekend at Willow? Oh, we don't really like that speaker, so we're just not going to go. We don't really connect with them. And so we're just going to stay home, and like the neighbors invited us to bike out for dinner. So we're going to do that instead. Now, I'm not saying that is a non-Tove decision, but we had become consumers because we were anticipating a show. We were looking for a performance. And when we did not feel that the show or the performance met our expectations, we would like rate it and judge it. Or like, I will also confess this to like, they kind of goes along with celebrity culture a little bit. They're a little bit intertwined. But I recall one time being in the lobby at Willow Creek and Bill Hybels walked by, and he had an entourage of bodyguards around him. And I behaved like he was, I don't know, Taylor Swift. Like my husband was like, Laura, he's not a celebrity. I was like, yes, he is. So I was contributing. I was a consumer contributing to the celebrity. Now he was, put himself in a position to be adored. But it goes both ways. The consumers feed the culture and the culture feeds the consumers.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's a good answer. And thank you for your truth telling there. The last question is from Simone, and she points out that it's hard when we believe that a Tove church could be possible, but we realize some people don't want that. What do we do with that cognitive dissonance? Like, accept that Tove is what we want to strive for, it's possible, but despair the distance it would take to get there.
That's so sad.
Yeah.
But yeah, it is despairing. It's despairing. I go back to, people have asked, I get this a lot too over the last few years, is my father and I, we've seen a lot. You've seen a lot, Becky. Like, you live in this world too. We've heard a lot of really painful stories, and we've sat with people that have been treated horribly, shamefully. And I kind of go back to where we started at the beginning of the session, is that it can be really, really depressing. It's not God. God is not. My friend Steve Carter says about, he was the former teaching pastor at Willow Creek who resigned in protest for how the church had responded and was treating the women. And he also said the same thing. Like, it's not, God didn't hurt me. People at Willow Creek hurt me. And he's like, there's 5 of them. They hurt me, but it wasn't God that hurt me. And I think that's the hope that I live in, and why I continue to speak and write what I do, because he wants Tov for us. He is Tov, and Jesus is the shepherd that led us and leads us to be Tov. It's not fallen people that we should follow. It's him. And people are going to fall short, and people are going to wound. But we need to remember that that's not what God wants for us.
Yeah, that's the perfect place to end, I think, is to remember that God is good, God is Tov, and our hope is in him to change all of us. Thank you so much, Laura. It was delightful to talk to you, and we'll hand back over to Atoma.
Thanks so much. This is such a challenging topic to discuss, but at the same time, a much needed topic. And I think you guys did just an incredible job. I think it also behooves each one of us to look into our own lives to see how we might be contributing to, I believe it's Ra, where we're not Tov ourselves. Because a lot of us can be good at, quote, throwing stones at the culture or our church and so forth. But, we need to look at ourselves and see what we need to work on at the same time, while we find those pockets of Tov, or if it means we need to move from our church to another church, or these kinds of things. But yeah, let's definitely go after, being the examples we need to, but also working on changing the culture in our churches. Right now, we're going to go ahead and take a break. We are going to be back at 11:10 in a few minutes, like 3 minutes right here. Probably grab a drink, come on back, and then we'll get started at 11:10 with communion in Christ's body. Thank you.